very much. I find myself feeling as uneasy sitting up here as I sometimes do on the bench of bishops in the House of Lords, feeling this is a kind of male-only preserve. And I'm aware this is the second panel this afternoon where it's felt like that. And I think that unease is something I need to confess right at the beginning. And it does seem, listening to this afternoon's proceedings, that the bishops probably rightly get it in the neck for being part of an overweening theocratic state which is making everybody believe what they don't want to believe on the one hand, and for being emasculated, colluding and irrelevant on the other hand. Whichever of those two we are, we're clearly undesirables. And I was reinforced in that view when I spoke in the welfare reform debate last year and found myself confronted by Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight, who began the question with, what right do you think bishops have got to say anything in the House of Lords? To which I replied, well, as much right as anybody else, because nobody's elected. We're all there because the system appoints us. And he said, but don't you think it's inappropriate for bishops to be bullying peers of the realm into taking opinions they don't want to take? And I thought, well, that's an interesting proposition, that we're 3% of the membership of the upper house, but somehow we're seen as brainwashing and depriving peers of the capacity to think independently just by our very presence. So these are all intriguing experiences, as is the experience of showing up in the House of Lords wearing robes when everybody else is dressed in suits, and being made to feel really sometimes that it's very strange that anybody who is rational and coherent and educated and intelligent could possibly do anything as foolish as believe in God and think that belief had anything to do with public policy making. 100 years ago, almost precisely the opposite might have been the case. It was difficult to understand how people in public life could not believe in God. And certainly part of our public sphere now seems to take precisely the opposite position. So I come to this discussion not from the position that bishops exercise any moral superiority or have any role as moral guardians in Parliament or elsewhere, but from the position of believing that the Judeo-Christian tradition has shaped a great deal of the public square in which we all move today, and that the very concept of liberal democracy and equality under the law is a concept which has been developed very largely in this country through the influence of the Christian tradition. That's my assertion, which is not to say the church isn't responsible for all kinds of injustices. It is. But it's based on that assumption that I believe it's appropriate for bishops to have a place in Parliament, speaking out of that tradition into the debates which take place. Now, if you walk out of the front gate of the Bishop's House in Leicester, within 200 yards of my front gate, you will find the parish church, a congregational church, the Jesus Army, the Islamic Academy, the local Gurdwara, a Christian Chinese centre, the Hindu Temple and Community Centre, and the Friends Meeting House. So when it comes to Leicester, there's an awful lot of religion about, of one sort or another. And over the last 14 years, I think the question that I've asked myself is all this diversity of religious presence essentially problematic for this city? Would life be much easier here if none of this was present? Or is it actually a huge part of the enrichment of the spiritual, cultural, intellectual, and social capital with which we live? And I've come to the conclusion the latter is the case. And I've asked myself almost every day, what is the role of a bishop in a world like this in order to enhance that social, cultural, and intellectual capital rather than diminish it? Now, last Sunday at our public remembrance event in Victoria Park in the city of Leicester, there were some 3,000 people gathered on Sunday morning under the great memorial arch to remember the fallen in war, to pray for those who continue to serve in the armed services. And what was telling, and has been telling in recent years, is that the prayers were led by a Muslim imam, by a leading member of the Orthodox synagogue, by the Hindus, the Baha'is, the Sikhs, and by the ecumenical officer of the city and the county, with myself as well. And it seems to me that the fact that that can happen in Leicester, which we take for granted, but cannot happen in so many of the world's cities, is something worth reflecting on. And it happens, I believe, because of the extraordinary hard work and labour and attention to detail sustained by many people over many years. And this is labour-intensive work which is well worth celebrating and which is transformational. And it's about that I want to say a word or two, and then say a word about how that works out in Parliament, of course. Now, there is, of course, a debate at the moment about whether the vision for a multicultural Britain that comes under the title multiculturalism is a desirable or sustainable one. I don't want to get into that argument too much at the moment. But there are those voices increasingly who argue that multiculturalism has developed in such a way that each community has minimal connection with any other, and relationships are characterized by little more than a distant, correct, and somewhat disdainful tolerance, inspired only by a need to preserve the peace of the realm, nothing more than that. And my argument, based on the experience of many years in leadership in Leicester, is that the so-called parallel lives paradigm is entirely unworkable, unsustainable, and unsatisfactory. For me, multiculturalism implies a path towards equal regard, hospitality, mutual enrichment, and reconciliation, and that's what makes for a society in which human beings really flourish. That is a path that demands personal and communal engagement, a great deal of humility and charity and determination. And I would argue that in many, if not nearly all the cities of the United Kingdom, of England rather, a leading role in that work is undertaken by the Church of England, often in unseen ways. Now, reference was made this morning to the Queen's visit to Lambeth Palace at the start of her Diamond Jubilee progress around the country last year. And she did indeed use that as an opportunity to celebrate the Church of England as the protector and the guarantor of a multicultural Britain. And I certainly have seen that role exercised in many cities by bishops acting as convener, as connector, and as host of other faiths, in a role which my colleagues, the faith leaders in the city of Leicester, would acknowledge is probably best done on a pragmatic basis by the Church of England bishop, not because he's likely to be any more skilled at it than anybody else, but simply because that is, as it were, a neutral ground from which this convening and hosting role can be exercised. Now, of course, there are many challenges that can be levelled at the Church of England's presumption in thinking of itself as convener and host in this way. One is the challenge that who is the Church of England, given its minority position in terms of membership, to define what Britishness is and to convene others around conversations about how they occupy a place in the public square in our national discourse. And I think my answer to that would be the Church of England is far from perfect in this role, far from ideal, but certainly better placed to do that than the political establishment is. And it seems to me that mistrust in the political establishment has grown very measurably and substantially in the last decade for reasons we can all imagine. And I would argue that what Britishness is and what the agendas are around which we can gather to discuss our common values and virtues is not best defined from a desk in Whitehall or Westminster. We can't begin to address what it is to belong to a nation unless we know what it is to belong to a city or a neighbourhood or a street. And that's why I think the work of what I would call the earthed establishment of the Church of England is so vital in those areas. The second challenge, of course, the place of the Church of England is based on this whole question of declining membership. It seems to me to be a significant argument, but not an adequate argument, because declining memberships attached to the memberships of political parties, trades unions, all public institutions, and if we're going to measure the memberships of the National Secular Society or the British Humanist Society, if that's the measure of significance, then the churches far outweigh almost all other voluntary membership organisations by a factor of tens or hundreds. And I don't think that's a basis on which we can establish the argument. So let me just explore briefly what I mean by earthed establishment. I mean the function of the Church of England as a presence. It may be quite a fragile presence, but nevertheless more of a presence than almost any other organisation or institution in every urban and rural neighbourhood, in every town and village, acting either through the one remaining public building or the one remaining public representative as part of the glue which creates social cohesion. And this is particularly significant in the city of Leicester, which is now over 50% migrant, and it's a fundamental task. And I could give you many examples, but one would be the attempt over the last decade to convene a forum of faith leaders, bringing together people who are opinion formers and exercise some kind of leadership role in the major world faiths and in the major neighbourhoods of Leicester, to discuss the connection between the global and the local, because that connection reverberates through cities like Leicester all the time. The outbreak of the Iraq War, the 7/7 bombings in London, the bombings of Gaza, the Afghan war, and so on, all of these create reverberations through our neighbourhoods and between our communities, which need to be addressed at the local level. And there have been iconic days, such as the day in which Baghdad was first bombed, when I appeared in the town hall with the Lord Mayor, with 2 or 3 imams and others, just to stand in silent, prayerful witness for the people of Baghdad. And people came up in tears saying, this is so important for our city and for who we believe we are as a nation. When the English Defence League came to town, twice in the last 18 months, we've gathered the faith leaders of the city in Leicester Cathedral to read from their scriptures, to speak about their vision of a peaceful and harmonious city, and then to stand in silent prayer together and to witness together when the EDL came to town. And these seem to me to be significant examples of the glue which holds our urban communities together under pressure. Now, of course, that relates to, and I've only got a few minutes, the notion of high establishment, and particularly perhaps the place of the Church of England in our national life and its constitutional position. It came under attack from John Gummer earlier on, but I would want to defend it and to say that the defence of it, as earlier speakers have said, comes not just from the bishops and from members of the Church of England, but from articulate representatives of other faiths as well. By their presence and leading in the house in prayer at the start of each sitting, the Lord's spiritual are a reminder of the historic understanding that as people we are governed by the Queen in Parliament under God. And I think their presence is also a reminder that our key constitutional institutions, the monarchy, our system of justice, education, healthcare, and charitable sector, have all been shaped, indeed many of them given birth to, by the Christian tradition. Of course, the engagement and participation of the Lord's spiritual in the day-to-day affairs of the Lord's varies from time to time, but it has increased in the last 5 years. Bishops speak not as members of a political party, as independent so-called Lords of Parliament. There's no bishop's whip, and trying to convene the bishops is frankly a practical nightmare, but that's exactly how it should be. The Church has consistently argued in debates about Lord's reform that the Appointments Commission should have a duty to ensure that the faith representation in the House of Lords is at least as diverse as in the population at large, and we have been consistent supporters of that principle. The position of the bishops in the Lords has been supported, as I've said, by serious voices from other faiths, including Professor Tariq Madood, who's said, "The minimal nature of the Anglican establishment, its proven openness to other denominations and faiths, seeking public space, and the fact that its very presence is an ongoing acknowledgement of the public character of religion are all reasons why it may be far less intimidating to the minority faiths than a triumphal secularism." And in his submission to the Royal Commission on Lord's Reform, Lord Sachs, then Chief Rabbi, said, "Disestablishment would be a significant retreat from the notion that we share any values and beliefs at all, and that would be a path to more, not fewer tensions. Establishment secures a central place for spirituality in the public square, and this benefits all faiths, not just Christianity." If you ask the question, I'm going to end with this, what is politics for? Then a Christian might answer as follows: if God's purpose for humanity is a common purpose, we have a duty to ask how the organizing of society makes this purpose harder or easier, more or less attainable. It's not that the Church approaches wider society with a detailed program which expects government to enact, but it does offer, or ought to offer, a series of searching questions about what government can make possible for people and communities, and about what barriers to creative communal life it needs to take away. And I believe that when the Church does that in partnership with other faiths, it's being true to its vocation and making a vital contribution to the common well-being of every citizen. Thank you very much.